This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 928 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog. Thanks for tuning in. We had some good and some bad with last week's Sleeper Show. On the bad side, Jalen Tolbert, he didn't do that much, and he only had a 12% target share. The Colts' backfield was pretty bad. Roschon Johnson didn't get it done. Daniel Jones was a bad top streamer, and Will Levis was a bad deep streamer. And Jalen Polk and Xavier Hutchinson were big busts. On the plus side, Romeo Doubs found the end zone twice. Tyler Algier had a great game. Zach Ertz was a decent play. Michael Wilson found the end zone. Josh Downs had another great week. And Drake May was a good streaming choice. It was far from the best week of the season for this Sleeper Show, though. Let's hope that week 7 treats us better. Before getting into the sleepers this week, though, I wanted to let you know about a cool new game over on Underdog that you can play through October. Head to the promotions tab in the Underdog app and play Red Zone Rush. It's sort of like a dating app, but instead of swiping left or right on a potential significant other, you're swiping left or right on who you think will get into the end zone that week. And best of all, every Red Zone Rush entry will receive a boost. You can check out Red Zone Rush by heading to UnderdogFantasy.com or downloading the app. If you're new to Underdog, make sure you sign up with promo code LATEROUND. You'll get a nice deposit bonus. You'll also get access to my rest of season rankings for absolutely free. Just sign up, use promo code LATEROUND, make a deposit, and start playing. That's promo code LATEROUND. We'll kick off this show as we always do by looking at players rostered in 10 to 50% of Yahoo leagues who you might want to consider this week. We'll start at quarterback, and we'll start with Drake May. Now, I talked up May on the 15 Transaction Show earlier this week. Not only can he bring a little bit with his legs, he had 38 rushing yards last week, but he gets the Jags this week. The Patriots don't have a high implied team total, but the Jags have been horrific against quarterbacks this year. They're worse in adjusted fantasy points allowed to the position. They've given up a top 12 performance to every quarterback they've faced, including Deshaun Watson. You couldn't ask for a much better spot for May. Matthew Stafford works this week too. I do have some concern that the Rams are just going to go with a run-heavy approach against Vegas, especially if Cooper Kupp isn't back. But for what it's worth, the Raiders have ranked 11th this year in pass rate allowed in neutral game scripts. Teams are throwing on them more than you might expect. Stafford hasn't been a great fantasy asset this year, but just a third of the Rams' touchdowns have come via the pass. There's some regression heading Stafford's way. And in a game where he's facing a top 5 matchup and where the Rams have a top 5 implied team total on the slate, he makes plenty of sense out of their bye. And I think that you could go back to Andy Dalton this week too, if the other two quarterbacks aren't available. The Panthers get Washington. Back in the first few weeks of the season, the Commanders were an obvious opponent to target. Now, they actually rank as just a slightly above average matchup in adjusted points allowed. But this game actually has the highest total on the slate. I do think that we could end up seeing a pretty run-heavy script by both offenses, but the environment overall is pretty good. That's why Dalton's getting a shout. Moving on to running back, there's a chance that we don't see Ramondre Stevenson again this week. And if that's the case, then Antonio Gibson makes for a good play. Last week without Stevenson, Gibson handled 62% of New England's running back rushes. He had a 13% target share. Now, I will say, his route participation, it was a little bit concerning. It was only 33%. They were rotating some other backs in there too. But we're looking for any kind of volume here. And the Patriots get an advantageous matchup against the Jags. So Gibson could be okay. We've also got Tyler Algier in this tier. I'm going to go back to him. Why wouldn't I go back to him? He's now seen running back rush shares of 53%, 33%, and 55% over his last 3 games. He's not going to give you a ton in the passing game, but the Falcons get a plus matchup against Seattle this week, and it's a game with one of the highest totals on the week. You could do worse than Tyler Algier. Now, I know the Vikings traded for Cam Akers, and he may dig into Ty Chandler's workload a little bit this week as long as Aaron Jones is out. And Aaron Jones could very easily miss this game. It's just that at the time of this recording, I don't know if he's in or out. But if he does miss the game, I do think that Ty Chandler is the 1A in that backfield. Now, it's not a great matchup. The Vikings get a Lions team that's been second best in the league this year against running backs by adjusted points allowed. But they've been pretty average in adjusted target share allowed to running backs. That's where Chandler can get his work done. So it's not a terrible play in a game with a healthy total. At wide receiver this week, I'm going to look closely at the Packers wide receivers. Romeo Doubs is available in 60% of Yahoo leagues. Christian Watson is also available in over half of them. So they both qualify here. I like them more than usual this week for a few reasons. First, the Packers could play in a relatively high-scoring game against the Texans. Second, the Texans have been much better against running backs than they have against receivers this year. They're a bottom 5 team for running backs by adjusted points allowed, but they're top 10 for wide receivers. And part of that is because teams have an above-average pass rate against them in neutral scripts. Third, Dontavian Wicks is banged up with a shoulder injury. He might still go this week, but even if he does, he may not see his normal snap rate, which means the Packers will have more stability at wide receiver with Doubs, Watson, and Jaden Reed. The environment's there, the circumstance is right. Romeo Doubs and Christian Watson are not terrible flex plays. Well, there's no more Amari Cooper in Cleveland, so I guess Jerry Jeudy's their guy. Now, is that going to bring fantasy football production? I mean, this week, I think Jerry Jeudy is still more of like a wide receiver 4. But the matchup's not terrible against Cincinnati. The Browns could see a pass-heavy script, and Judy's already at a 19% target share this year. We could see that rise by a handful of percentage points without Amari Cooper. So if you're desperate, he's not a bad volume play. And you could probably say the same thing about Demario Douglas. As I talked about on the 15 transactions episode, we've seen Douglas hit some big target shares in 3 of his last 4 games. As a slot operator, he gets a Jacksonville team this week that's allowed an above average target share to that area of the field. And the Jags are also just bad against wide receivers in general. They've given up more adjusted points to the position than any other team in football. So Demario Douglas is in a good spot. Xavier Legette, when healthy, has been running routes on over 80% of Andy Dalton's dropbacks. And that route data is from PFF, by the way. Now, that didn't match to an awesome target share last week for Legette, but getting on the field and running routes, that's the first step needed for fantasy production. And there's a chance that we see more of that production this week. Legette gets a Washington team that's allowed the 3rd most adjusted points to wide receivers this year. And like I said earlier, that game has a high game total. So with this one, you're associating a player getting reps, a young player who hypothetically should only get better. You're associating that with a high scoring affair. That's why Legette works. With Marvin Harrison Jr. dealing with a concussion, there's a chance that he doesn't go this week. That would make Michael Wilson the team's top target. He's hit double-digit PPR points in 3 of his last 4. He's got a target share per game rate of 23% during this time. He's also been above a 90% route participation in 3 of those 4 games. Now, the Cardinals get the Chargers this week. LA actually ranks first in the NFL in adjusted slot target share allowed to wide receivers, meaning teams are really attacking the slot against the Chargers. That doesn't benefit Wilson like it does their main slot guy, Greg Dortch. Dortch is actually rostered in just 5% of Yahoo leagues. But since I'm already talking about the Cardinals wide receivers, I'll shout him out here. We've seen Dortch hit a 15% target share in 3 of his last 4. It wouldn't be surprising if he gets well over that mark in this game, especially if Marvin Harrison Jr. is sidelined. So Wilson's probably a safer option without Harrison, but Greg Dortch has the matchup. At tight end, I'm going to go back to the weekly trusty floor pick, and that's Cade Otton. Otton hasn't dropped below a 17% target share in over a month, and he's still running routes at one of the best rates that you can find at tight end. The Bucs get the Ravens this week. That's a good setup for the passing attack. Teams are throwing the ball a lot against Baltimore. The Ravens have faced the highest pass rate in the league by far in neutral game scripts. Tampa Bay ranks 7th in neutral script pass rate. So a 17% target share could go a really long way in this game. We're also going to go back to Zach Ertz. Ertz gets Carolina. I've already talked enough about that game. It could end up being high scoring. On the season, he has almost an 18% target share in this Commanders offense, and he's running routes at a top 10 rate. So if you need a higher floor option, you can go back to Zach Ertz. I also think Hunter Henry and Colby Parkinson are in play. Henry gets a beatable Jags defense and saw his highest target share since week 2 against the Texans last week. Colby Parkinson has been running routes at a really high rate, and he actually hasn't dipped below a 20% target share in 3 straight games. I'd like Parkinson more if Cooper Kupp doesn't play, but I don't think that he's toast if Kupp is active. We're now looking at some deeper plays or players rostered in fewer than 10% of Yahoo leagues. I don't have any quarterbacks in this tier, so we'll start with running backs. We'll go to Dearness Johnson. There's no doubt that Johnson saw the work that he did last week because of the game script that Jacksonville faced. And I don't anticipate that kind of game script this week against New England. With that being said, Johnson was still Jacksonville's receiving back last week. He ran 4 times the number of routes as Tank Bigsby, and New England's been a top 10 team for running backs this year by adjusted points allowed. We also can never guarantee a game is going to go in a certain direction. The Jags may be favorites, but it doesn't guarantee a victory. Now, this is all assuming that Travis Etienne's not going to play. And with him sidelined, I do like Tank Bigsby this week a lot more than Dearness Johnson. But as a deep sleeper, Dearness Johnson is fine. It sounds like Trey Sermon is banged up with a knee issue, and we know that Jonathan Taylor is dealing with an ankle. Tyler Goodson is the next man up. Goodson has seen about a third of the team's running back rushes without Jonathan Taylor, and he's been a threat in the passing game with 7 catches over his last 2 games. He'll be the start for Indy this week if those 2 running backs are out, and the Colts get the Dolphins. Miami's a top 5 matchup for running backs this year by adjusted fantasy points allowed. So he's a good play if Taylor and Sermon are out. Savon Ahmed was signed to the practice squad yesterday, by the way, signaling that these injuries, they're not nothing. So it sounds like Nick Chubb is going to be back this week, but we have no clue what kind of workload he's going to see. Deontay Foreman's sort of the next man up on that depth chart because Jerome Ford is hurt, but he's more of a redundant piece to Chubb. He plays a similar type of role. Where I'm intrigued is with Pierre Strong, because Chubb's never been a massive pass catcher. Strong's coming off a game where he ran a route on 53% of Cleveland's dropbacks. Foreman was at 15%. Foreman hasn't been above 20% all year. So the idea here is that Chubb doesn't see a huge workload. But even if he does, a negative game script could hit against the Bengals. And if that happens, Strong is the one who stands to benefit, at least as a deep play. At wide receiver, don't forget about Jordan Whittington. I think he's a great play within the context of being a sleeper if Cooper Kupp does not play. But Whittington was getting more run before their bye, so even if Kupp is in, he might be okay. And I say that because he's only run 36% of his routes this year from the slot. I thought when Cooper Kupp went down that Whittington was more of the direct replacement for Kupp, that he was going to live in the slot. Kupp was around the 70% range before he went down this year, and that just hasn't been the case. Whittington's also coming off games where he had a 97% and 85% route participation, and his target shares over his last 2, 28% and 22%. The matchup's fine. I talked about that with Matthew Stafford, so don't sleep on Jordan Whittington. I talked about this on the 10 Trends episode yesterday, but Noah Brown is running as Washington's wide receiver too, and he finally had a big target share game in week 6 with a 24% target share. This week, it's a plus matchup against Carolina and a potentially high-scoring game. So he makes a lot of sense. Now, I've got to mention Bub Means here as well for all the reasons that I talked about on the 15 Transactions episode. Without Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed, Means is their top wide receiver, which could simply lead to a lot of volume. The matchup isn't great, but Patrick Surtain is likely out as well. I just don't have that confirmation right now. So Bub Means he kind of works. And then there's one more wide receiver I got for you. It's deeper than the other ones that I've talked about. It's Sterling Shepard. Shepard has run just 25% of his routes from the slot this year. Baltimore, their opponent this week, has seen the second lowest adjusted slot target share to wide receivers this season. To put that another way, teams are attacking the outside against Baltimore, and that's adjusted for strength of opponent. In week 6, Sterling Shepard ran a route on 83% of Tampa Bay's dropbacks. That turned into an 11% target share. If he sees a slight bump in target share given the matchup this week, and that matchup is against a team that sees a lot of passing volume against them, then there's a case for Sterling Shepard as a deep sleeper. And then I've got 2 more tight ends for you. Juwan Johnson's one of them. That's just with all the Saints injuries. He had a season-high 75% route participation in week 6, and while that didn't turn into a lot of production, he could be force-fed more targets with the injuries in New Orleans right now. And then Grant Calcaterra is the last one. Dallas Goedert is trending to be out this week, and Calcaterra stepped in last week and ran a route on 89% of Philly's dropbacks. That's a really, really high rate. That resulted in a strong 17% target share. The Eagles get the Giants this week, and New York has seen the 10th highest adjusted target share to tight ends this season. So he's a very interesting streamer. Now, in terms of defensive streamers this week, I mentioned Cincinnati on the 15 Transactions episode. I think they're a great play against Cleveland. There's also Indianapolis against Miami, the Rams against the Raiders, and I think you could play the Patriots against the Jags. But overall, it's kind of a tough week for defensive streamers. Lastly, let's take a look at some pick'em choices over on Underdog this week based on this sleeper show by using only players on this show. We hit on both of these last week. To start, we're going to go higher than 204.5 passing yards for Drake May against Jacksonville. Teams against the Jags have seen 70 more passing yards compared to their season-long averages. We'll also go higher than 34.5 receiving yards for Noah Brown. He's already been above that mark twice this year, and now he gets a plus matchup. So Drake May and Noah Brown, that's who we're riding with this week. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you had subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Late Round QB, and make sure you're subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/@LateRoundFF. Thanks for listening, everyone. Tomorrow, I got 2 more episodes for you. I got the mailbag episode that drops early in the morning, and then another episode of Late Round Perspectives. I'll talk to you then.